Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
I've learned that the deepest kind of pain doesn't come from yelling or fists or dramatic scenes that you see in TV dramas. No, it comes from a smile. A toast. A room full of laughter where you sit quietly, fully present, but somehow completely invisible. That's where the slowest bruises form, in silence, over decades, with nobody watching. Or worse, with everyone watching and pretending not to notice. It was a Saturday evening, late spring, and the backyard was done up like something out of a magazine spread, white linen-covered tables, fairy lights strung between oak branches, and wine that flowed a little too freely for 5 in the evening. My mother, Diane, had been planning this little gathering for months, though we all knew the word little had nothing to do with it. It was her way of reminding everyone who she was, the woman who raised the perfect daughter, the woman who hosts wine-paired dinners like she was born with a Martha Stewart subscription in her veins. And like clockwork, just before dessert, she stood up. She had that glassy-eyed smile that she used when she wanted to seem humble, but was practically vibrating with pride, the kind that made her voice lift at the end of every sentence, like a stage actor waiting for applause. "I just want to say," she began, her hand gently touching Emily's shoulder, "how proud I am of this young woman right here." There it was. The cue. The room got quiet, polite smiles forming, some people even nodding, like we hadn't all heard this a dozen times before. My fork was still in my hand, midair, as I watched her other hand raise her wine glass, the crystal catching the string lights just right, another perfect moment. "She's my pride and joy," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "She's built such a brilliant career. She's elegant. She's compassionate, I mean. Just look at her." I did look at her. Sitting there in that stupid pastel blazer, with that composed face she wore like armor, her soft nods timed perfectly with the beat of our mother's praise. Emily was always good at that, knowing when to shine, when to demur. She made it look effortless. I didn't say a word. I didn't scoff or roll my eyes or break the awkward silence with a joke, the way I used to when we were younger, and the same thing happened over birthday dinners and Thanksgiving pie. Back then, I thought if I made enough people laugh, maybe someone would notice that I was there too. But this time, I didn't flinch. I waited. And when the clapping started, yes, actual clapping from a few of the cousins who either didn't know better or had learned to keep the peace at all costs, I just stood up. Not fast. Not dramatic. I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope I had been holding all evening. It wasn't thick, not padded, no red stamp or anything flashy. Just a white envelope, unsealed, because I didn't want it to feel theatrical. I just wanted it to feel necessary. I walked around the table slowly. My heels crunched softly on the gravel path. My mother's eyes found mine about halfway across. She smiled, confused. Probably thought I was going to hand her a birthday card, maybe a belated thank you note. I placed it in her hand without a word, gently enough that she almost didn't react. Then I said, calm as ever, "Thought you'd want to know what her job application says." It was like someone turned off the volume in the backyard. The wine stopped mid-sip. The laughter died in throats. My cousin Tom coughed softly but didn't break eye contact. Emily froze. Not visibly, not dramatically, but her chin tucked just slightly, like she wanted to disappear under that table. My mother looked down at the envelope like it had started to bleed. I could see her fingers hesitate. She looked at Emily first, and that's when I saw it. Not fear. Not panic. Just resignation. Emily gave the tiniest shake of her head. Not a no, not a plea, just a slow, downward tilt. That's what made my mother's hands start to tremble. Not the paper. Not the envelope. But the realization that maybe, just maybe, everything she built that speech on was a lie. Now here's the thing. I know this is where people start wondering what the hell was in the envelope. And trust me, we'll get there. But let me ask you something first. Have you ever sat at a table where everyone sees you as the lesser one? Not because you've done anything wrong, but because someone else has done everything right just loudly enough to drown you out? Have you ever watched someone get rewarded for simply existing while you worked, suffered, compromised, and were told that you should be more like them? That you should smile more, try harder, be less sensitive? Because if you've been there even once, you'll understand why I didn't raise my voice. Why I didn't make a scene. Why I just handed over a simple envelope that made my mother's wine glass rattle against the table. Because sometimes, the loudest revenge is the one whispered in truth. And believe me, this was just the beginning. There's something uniquely exhausting about carrying years of quiet disappointment, not the kind that explodes in one defining moment, but the kind that builds layer upon layer like sediment under a river, forming the slow, heavy weight that eventually reshapes everything it rests on. I didn't become bitter overnight, and I certainly didn't plan what happened at that dinner in a flash of anger. No, it was years of sitting in silence, of clapping for someone else's spotlight, of swallowing words that burn like acid in my throat, until I realized I wasn't being noble by keeping quiet. I was just letting them write my story for me, while I held the pen. I remember the first time I realized Emily was the one not just in our mother's eyes, but in everyone's. It was second grade. I'd spent weeks working on a shoebox diorama for some history project, cutting out tiny trees, painting blue rivers with my shaky little hands, and carefully writing facts in neat little lines across the cardboard. I was proud of that thing. Really proud. I watched our mom load it into the car, set it gently on the back seat. But then Emily, who was in kindergarten at the time, tripped and scraped her knee on the sidewalk, and by the time we got to school, my project was half crushed under the bags of ice and napkins our mom threw on it in a rush to comfort her. That night, over dinner, Mom told everyone how brave Emily had been, how sweet and quiet she was while they patched her up, and how the teacher said she was the kind of girl who makes the room brighter. No one asked about my diorama. No one noticed it was gone. That's how it was, again and again, moments where I did something worthy, something that maybe should have mattered, but then something happened to Emily, and suddenly, my efforts vanished like they'd never existed at all. She cried prettier. Her messes were softer. Her mistakes were just phases. I was expected to be the stable one, the responsible one, the one who didn't need the spotlight because I was so mature or so grounded, which, in translation, meant I was the easiest one to forget. It didn't help that Emily played her part to perfection. She wasn't cruel, not in any obvious way, not the hair-pulling, sabotage your diary kind of sister. She smiled at the right moments, hugged when people watched, and let compliments bounce off her like she hadn't been waiting all day to hear them. But she knew. Of course, she knew. And over the years, it started to feel less like she was simply the favorite and more like she enjoyed it, like she needed it. She learned early that our mother would move heaven and earth to preserve the image of her perfect daughter, and by the time we were both adults, Emily had learned to weaponize it. There was the time she missed my college graduation because she had a last-minute interview, and Mom, instead of apologizing on her behalf, told me I should be proud that Emily had such ambition. I still remember standing on that sun-baked football field in my cap and gown, watching all the other families hug and take photos, while our mother adjusted her pearls and scrolled through her phone, texting Emily about what hors d'oeuvres to pick up for her client's open house. And then there was Milo, the dog I adopted when I first moved out, a wiry mutt with anxious eyes and the kind of loyalty that made it hard to leave him even for a grocery run. When he got sick, I spent 3 nights sleeping on the kitchen floor beside him, hand-feeding him boiled rice and cradling his head through seizures. When he died, I didn't get a call from Mom. I got a Facebook tag under a photo of Emily holding a neighbor's new golden retriever with a caption about the joy of new beginnings. So no, I didn't just stumble into that envelope. It wasn't spite that drove me to dig. It was survival. It was the need to finally step out of the shadow that had smothered me for decades and claim one goddamn square inch of sunlight. I wish I could say that uncovering the truth about Emily started with some big, dramatic event, a suspicious phone call, a folder left open on a shared computer, but in reality, it was a forwarded email. A simple mistake. One of those accidental reply-alls that nobody notices until it's too late. I'd been helping Mom set up a virtual donation campaign for one of her dozens of pet charities, and she used my computer while hers was getting refreshed, as she put it. I'd forgotten to sign out of my email, and the next morning, there it was, a forwarded message from Emily, Meant for Mom, accidentally sent to me. It was about her job. Or more accurately, about a job she was trying to get. A very impressive one, corporate PR for some international real estate firm. But the strange part wasn't the job description. It was the resume attached. I opened it without hesitation, thinking maybe I was supposed to do something with it. But the moment I started reading, my heart began to race. It wasn't one big lie. It was 1,000 little ones. Titles she never held. Degrees she never finished. Internships I knew for a fact she'd quit halfway through. There was even a glowing reference from a CEO who, according to a quick Google search, had been dead for over a year. At first, I thought maybe I was misreading it, that maybe I had the timeline wrong. But the more I looked, the more certain I became Emily had built her professional house of cards on a foundation of half-truths and Photoshop. And more than that, she had copied pieces of my own resume, word-for-word descriptions of project work I'd done for companies she'd never even interacted with. I remember sitting there, staring at the screen and thinking not how could she, but of course she did. Of course she'd gotten away with it. Because when you're someone's pride and joy, people don't ask questions. They don't check dates. They don't dig. They just smile and toast and say things like, she's going places. So I printed it. Quietly. Folded it once. Slipped it into an envelope. And I waited. Because I knew that eventually, our mother would raise that glass again. I just didn't know yet what else I was going to find before that happened. And believe me, I wasn't done digging. Not by a long shot. There's a particular kind of silence that settles into your bones when you start to realize that the truth you've stumbled onto might be more dangerous than you first imagined. The kind of silence that doesn't scream or howl, but hums beneath everything, vibrating just low enough that only you can hear it, like a warning note playing on repeat. After I printed out Emily's embellished resume and folded it into that envelope, I thought I'd already reached the bottom of the well, that I'd found the lie, unmasked the performance, and now all that was left was to expose it. But the thing about lies, especially the kind that people build entire lives on, is that they're never just a single brick. They're walls, intricate ones, built in layers, sealed with charm, maintained with habit, and constantly repainted to hide the cracks. It started bothering me, the inconsistencies, the way Emily had replicated sections of my resume word for word, the dates that didn't align, the fake reference from a man who no longer walked the earth, and I realized I couldn't just stop there, not now. Not when something about the whole thing itched at me like a bad rash. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Emily's entire adult life had existed in snapshots, carefully curated and selectively shared, always just enough to impress, but never enough to scrutinize. Her job descriptions were vague, her Instagram posts were perfectly posed, and whenever someone asked where she worked now, it was always somewhere in corporate communications, said with a breezy confidence that made people nod and move on. I needed more, not because I wanted to hurt her, although I won't lie, that was becoming easier to imagine, but because part of me still couldn't believe it. Still needed to see the whole puzzle laid out to finally let go of the decades I'd spent questioning if maybe I was just being bitter, just being jealous, just being the difficult one. So I made a phone call. A calculated one. I dialed Dean, Emily's ex, the one she dated for 3 years, and then abruptly dumped with a vague explanation about different paths. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I remembered him being decent, grounded, and just jaded enough that he might actually pick up. To my surprise, he did. "Sarah," he said, sounding more curious than suspicious. "Haven't heard from you since. What, your dad's retirement party?" I skipped the small talk. "Dean, I need to ask you something about Emily. It's important." There was a pause, long enough to make me wonder if he was going to hang up, but instead, he sighed. "You digging too?" That caught me off guard. "What do you mean too?" He let out a breath that sounded like he'd been waiting a long time to exhale it. "Look, I'm not trying to stir anything up. I've moved on. But Emily, she's not what she sells. Never was. I kept my mouth shut for years because I thought maybe she just needed the illusion to survive. But then I saw some stuff that didn't sit right, and when I asked questions, she turned cold, like I'd broken some unspoken contract." "What kind of stuff?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter. She told her landlord she was working for a European nonprofit, he said, his voice steady, but she was using your LinkedIn profile to write cover letters. I saw them, she just changed the name. And one time she asked me to pretend to be a reference for a job she wasn't qualified for. Said it was just a formality. When I pushed back, she called me unsupportive. A sick feeling crawled through my stomach, but I kept my voice even. Why didn't you tell anyone? He laughed, but it wasn't funny. Who was gonna listen? Your mom? She practically built a shrine to her in your living room. No one questions Emily. That's the whole game. I thanked him, hung up, and sat in silence for a long time, replaying every moment of praise, every toast, every casual dismissal I'd endured while my sister sculpted a version of her life out of stolen credentials and curated lies. It wasn't just a few resumed lies anymore. It was a system, an identity she maintained with the full support, conscious or not, of our mother. And if Dean had noticed, if he'd been asked to lie directly, then how many others had been part of this web? Still, none of this explained how she got away with it so cleanly. That's when I started thinking about the money. Emily had an apartment in a good neighborhood. She took vacations. She dressed like someone who didn't blink at $300 shoes. But her job history, even if it had been real, didn't add up to that kind of lifestyle. And that's when another memory came crawling back, something I hadn't thought about in years, because I'd convinced myself it didn't matter. Grandpa Walt's will. He passed when I was 25, not long after I'd moved into my first real apartment. I remembered being told that most of the estate had been used for medical bills, that what was left was minimal, and that my mom would take care of all the legal stuff. I didn't question it. I was grieving. I was trusting. And Emily had barely shown up for the funeral. But now, with everything else unraveling, I started wondering what had actually happened with that inheritance. Because if there was money floating around, and if Emily had it, I knew one thing for certain: she hadn't earned it. I drove to the old law office that had handled Grandpa's estate. The firm had changed hands, but they still had digital archives, and I gave them my name, my ID, and a story about wanting to clarify some paperwork for my own records. It took them 30 minutes, and when the file landed in my hands, I sat there, staring at the first page of the original will, and felt something inside me tilt permanently. To my name, in black ink, was written, "To Sarah Jane Harrison, I leave the remainder of my estate, including the property on Willow Lane and all remaining financial assets." She has always shown the kind of strength, kindness, and quiet integrity that I believe defines the best of this family. Let this be her start, not her burden. It wasn't much. Maybe $50,000 in total, and a tiny property we'd called the cottage, which had long since been sold. But I'd never known he left it to me. No one told me. No one even hinted. The signatures were dated. The documents were clear. And when I checked the records, I found that the property had been transferred within 6 months, not to me, but to a shell company registered under our mother's name. That was when the weight of it all hit me. Emily didn't build her life on success. She built it on what should have been mine. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel bitter. I didn't feel jealous. I felt angry, a clean, focused, purposeful anger. Because if they wanted to build their empire on lies, I was finally ready to let the truth bring the whole thing down. But I still had one envelope left to prepare. And this time, it was going to carry more than just a resume. There are moments in life when the foundation beneath everything you've known doesn't just crack, it shifts, subtly at first, like the faint groan of wood settling in an old house, and then all at once, as if the weight of years held back by politeness and denial finally forces the floor to cave in beneath your feet, exposing what had been rotting just out of sight. I sat in the parking lot of that dusty law office for what felt like an hour, the folder heavy in my lap, though its weight was purely symbolic, a handful of pages, just enough to unravel nearly 15 years of lies that no one had thought I'd ever question. Or worse, no one had thought I'd be brave enough to pursue. But there it was, in black and white, the clearest evidence that my grandfather had not just remembered me, but had intended, with full consciousness and deliberation, to give me something meaningful, something solid, something real. And my mother had simply erased it, rewritten the story as if his last act. of love toward me had never existed at all. It wasn't only the betrayal that gutted me, although that would have been enough, but the implication that they had counted on me never digging, never asking, never stepping out of the carefully crafted role I had been assigned since childhood, the quiet daughter. The one who took care of things, the one who understood, the one who forgave without receiving an apology. They had gambled that I would stay in the shadows out of loyalty or exhaustion or fear of confrontation, and for years, they had been right. But something about holding that folder, seeing the curve of my grandfather's handwriting, the choice of words that didn't just name me, but recognized me, saw me, it was like discovering a lifeline I hadn't realized I'd needed. A voice reaching across the silence to say, "You mattered. You always did. They just didn't let you know it." I took the long way home, not because I was unsure of what to do, but because I needed space to think, to feel, to begin shaping what came next, not in anger, though there was plenty of that simmering beneath my skin, but with intention, with precision, with the kind of focus that only comes after a lifetime of being told you were overreacting. I knew that simply revealing the will wouldn't be enough. Too much time had passed, too many legal transfers had taken place, and the money was likely long gone. But this wasn't about reclaiming dollars and property anymore. This was about forcing the truth into the open where it could no longer be ignored, no longer swept under the rug of family obligation and polite denial. It was about taking back the narrative they had stolen from me, piece by piece. When I got home, I pulled out the second envelope, the one I had been saving for something bigger than a resume lie, and I began assembling the contents like someone preparing evidence for a trial. The will. The property transfer documents. Copies of emails showing communication between Emily and the real estate firm that handled the sale. A side-by-side comparison of Emily's falsified job application next to my own resume, highlighting the sections she had lifted, word for word, without shame. And then, just for good measure, a note I found buried in a box of old letters, a birthday card from Grandpa Walt, written in his usual half-scrawl, that read, "One day, all this will be yours, and I hope you'll use it to build a life that's yours alone, not one made to impress anyone else." That sentence stayed with me. It wrapped itself around my ribs and refused to let go, not because it was poetic or grand, but because it was simple and clear and completely at odds with what actually happened. He had wanted me to build something. They had stolen the tools. Still, there was one more thing I needed before I could move forward, not legal, not financial, but personal. I needed to hear her say it. I needed Emily to admit, even just once, that she knew what she had done, that all those years of smiling across tables and pretending we were equals were built on the silent knowledge that she had taken something from me and chosen, over and over again, to never give it back. I called her on a Tuesday, late afternoon, knowing that she was least likely to expect it then, and I could tell from the hesitation in her voice when she picked up that she knew something was wrong. "Hey," she said cautiously, her tone light but tight. "Everything okay?" "I found Grandpa's will," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "The original one." There was a pause, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. "Sarah," she began, her voice slipping into that practiced sympathy she used when she wanted to sound understanding without actually conceding anything. "You know how complicated all that was. Mom handled most of it because you were going through a lot." "I wasn't going through anything except believing you," I said, my voice low, steady, not angry, just tired. "You knew what he left me. You knew, and you said nothing. You took it. You let her take it." There was silence again, heavier this time, and then a sigh that tried to sound exasperated, like I was being unreasonable. "It wasn't like that. Mom thought it would be better for everyone. We were trying to keep the family together." "No," I said, and this time, the word cut through her excuses like a blade. "You were trying to keep the story together. The one where you're the good daughter, the accomplished one, the center of everything." "Sarah, why are you doing this now?" she asked, her voice sharpening, panic starting to bleed through the calm. "Because you don't get to be the hero of this family while standing on my back," I said. "Not anymore." I hung up before she could answer. I wasn't interested in her justifications or half-confessions. I had what I needed: her silence, her pause, her failure to deny. It was as close to a confession as I was ever going to get, and frankly, it was enough. I sealed the second envelope, thicker than the first, heavier in every way that mattered, and I placed it next to my purse. I didn't need to plan the moment. I knew it would come. Diane would raise her glass again. She always did. She would smile with that same manic pride she'd worn like armor for decades, and she would offer up Emily once again as proof of her own success as a mother. And when she did, I would be ready. Because this time, I wasn't just handing over a piece of paper. I was handing over everything they'd tried to bury and watching to see who dared to look away. It's strange how quiet a room can become in the span of a breath, how the familiar clink of forks against plates and the murmur of casual conversation can suddenly evaporate, leaving behind a stillness so absolute it almost hums in your ears like pressure before a storm. And that's exactly what happened the moment I handed my mother the first envelope, a moment that, in its simplicity, held more weight than all the years of spoken disappointments and unspoken betrayals that had built the scaffolding of our family dynamic. The air shifted before a single word was said, and though Diane's smile didn't immediately falter, that practiced, polished grin she wore like a costume, I saw the tremor in her fingers as she broke the seal. Her eyes scanning the page with the same detached curiosity she reserved for party menus and wine labels, until comprehension landed like a slap. It didn't arrive in the form of rage or denial, but in something quieter, more devastating, the slow unraveling of a story she had told herself so many times that she'd forgotten it wasn't real. She looked at Emily. Not at me, not at anyone else at the table. Just at Emily, her gaze narrowing as if, for the first time, she wasn't seeing her daughter, but a stranger wearing her daughter's face, a face that had been so easy to love, to elevate, to build her entire maternal identity around. And Emily, in that moment, didn't speak, didn't protest, didn't offer the usual half-lie wrapped in charm and breathy assurance. She simply froze, as if the stillness of the room had calcified her, and maybe it had, because what do you say when the scaffolding begins to crumble in front of the very people who helped you hold it up? Diane's lips parted, but no words came. She blinked once, twice, and I watched the weight of it all settle onto her shoulders, not just the resume, but everything that came before it, everything that made it possible, the favoritism, the willful blindness, the subtle erasures of my existence so she could keep building her story around someone else's illusion of success. Her hands shook, just slightly, as she folded the page back into the envelope like she was trying to hide it again, to push the truth back into the neatness of sealed paper. But there was no sealing it anymore. And just when it looked like the moment might pass, like the room might simply absorb the tension and shift back into the safety of avoidance, I reached into my bag and pulled out the second envelope, this one thicker, heavier, not in volume but in consequence, and I placed it quietly on the table between the salad plates and the wine-stained cloth napkins. One more thing, I said, my voice calm but so sharp it might as well have been a scalpel. From Grandpa. This time, she didn't open it right away. She stared at it like it might burn her fingers, and for the first time in my life, I saw something I never thought I'd see in my mother's eyes. Not disappointment, not judgment, but fear. The kind that comes not from the contents of a document, but from the realization that the entire narrative you've relied on to make sense of your world is no longer under your control. Emily reached for it, almost instinctively, but Diane stopped her, her hand hovering protectively over the envelope like a shield, as if she knew, on some level deeper than words, that this wasn't something Emily could defend against, not with charm, not with tears, not with denial. And she was right. Because inside that envelope wasn't just proof of a falsified resume or evidence of a decades-old financial betrayal, it was a mirror, held up to both of them, forcing them to see themselves not as they wished to be seen, but as they truly were. The original will. The real inheritance. The card from Grandpa, with handwriting she couldn't forge and sentiment she couldn't explain away. Copies of the property transfer. Side-by-side resumes showing word-for-word theft. It wasn't an attack. It was an unveiling. The room was still silent, but now the silence buzzed with discomfort, with curiosity, with the kind of quiet judgment that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. I could feel the eyes on me from cousins, in-laws, distant relatives who had long ago accepted the story of Emily as fact, who had watched for years as I was treated like the afterthought. The supporting character in a narrative that didn't have space for more than one protagonist. And now they were looking at me differently, not with pity, but with something closer to recognition, as if, for the first time, the outline of my presence had become clear. Emily finally found her voice, brittle and tight, like something pulled from under ice. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not with anger, but with something that almost resembled hurt, not the hurt of injustice, but the wounded pride of someone who had never been told no. I didn't respond immediately, because I wanted her to feel the weight of the moment, the truth of it, not just as an attack, but as a reckoning. "Because you made me invisible," I said at last, not raising my voice, not needing to. "For years. And she helped you. You both took and pretended it was owed to you. But none of it was. And I'm done pretending otherwise." Diane finally opened the second envelope, her movements slow and careful, like each sheet inside might explode. And as she read, as she pieced it all together, saw in print the reality she'd refused to acknowledge, her expression didn't crumble all at once. It fractured slowly, piece by piece, until the woman who had stood so proudly over countless toasts to her perfect daughter now looked like someone realizing that the applause had been for a performance she'd never actually seen. She didn't defend herself. She didn't defend Emily. She just sat back in her chair, eyes unfocused, and said nothing, which, in its own way, was the clearest admission I'd ever gotten from her. I stood then, because there was nothing else to say. Nothing else to reveal. My revenge was never meant to humiliate them, not in the way they might have feared, but to restore what they had stolen. Not money, not property, not even pride, but the simple dignity of being seen, being remembered, being valued not for spectacle, but for substance. And as I walked out of that backyard, past the fairy lights, the stunned faces, the half-finished wine glasses, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. And maybe, for the first time, I understood that freedom doesn't always come from forgiveness or forgetting. Sometimes, it comes from simply refusing to carry their lies anymore. But as the screen door creaked shut behind me and the air shifted again, I couldn't help but wonder whether Diane would try to stitch the narrative back together, whether she'd call me in a few days, voice soft and rehearsed, asking why I'd done it. Trying to rewrite the script again with her usual spin. Or maybe she'd double down, defend Emily even in the face of the facts. Or maybe, and this, somehow, was the worst possibility, maybe she'd finally see me and realize that she never had. I don't know what happens next. I don't know what they'll do with the truth now that it's no longer mine to protect. But I do know this. For once, the silence is mine. And that's enough.